Andy emailed me a few months ago, and he said, would you be interested in speaking at the Build conference? And I said, absolutely, I'd be thrilled to come out. There's something really important that you need to know, though, is I'm not really a web designer. And he said, that's okay. He said, great, we'll just put you after me talking about coffee, and you can open up for lunch. So I'm the opening act for lunch today. My talk is called The Shape of Design, and really what I'm interested in is, because I do a little bit of web work, but it's not my primary discipline, I'm really interested in sort of thinking about the patterns that are similar between what all of you do and what I do. What are the things that they have in common? And I think the easiest way to maybe start out with this is just a story. Before I get into that, the things that we have in common is I want to talk about who we are and what we're doing as people that make things and as designers. And I want to talk about where we're going as an industry, and maybe just taking a little bit of a broader viewpoint than just necessarily web design or interaction design. There's a story that a good friend of mine, she has a hard time telling this story, but I think it's a really good story, so I want to open up with that. A few years ago, she was hired by a nonprofit organization in the States to build a website for them. And the initial budget for that job for this nonprofit was about $7,000. And it was just a little bit too, it wasn't enough money for the work at hand, but she really liked what they were doing. And just through dialogue, she was able to work up the budget of that job to about $10,000. And it still wasn't quite enough, but she was really happy with being able to do work for a charity that she believed in, and just feeling like that was good enough to make her want to work on this project. So she got into it and she started working on it, and several weeks later the job finished. The client was thrilled. She was really happy with the result. And the client was so happy that they decided to launch this new website at sort of a black tie gala that they were throwing. They wanted to launch and unveil this new website that she had made, and because she made it, she gets to come and be fancy pants with all of these people. So she walks in, and right as you walk in, what she saw was this giant ice sculpture. You know the big ice sculptures that guys come in with chainsaws and carve a giant block of ice? So she sees this giant ice sculpture with two swans with their necks sort of interlocking very gracefully, just absolutely gorgeous. And it's one of those things, she told me, that you just have to walk up and get close to it to make sure that it's real. And she walks up, and as she gets closer, there's a man standing next to her. And she says to herself, wow. And he hears her, and he says, it's so hard to believe that they would spend $15,000 on an ice sculpture for something that's going to be melted by the end of the night. And that just made her feel absolutely awful. It's a really great story for me because I think it encapsulates some of the frustrations that I have working with people. But also it gets at a larger idea that it's really hard to sort of quantify exactly what the value of design is. I'll be talking a little bit about that. And when I'm talking about the value of design, or when I'm talking about design, I'm not really talking about my work, and I don't think that I'm necessarily talking about your work either. I'm more interested in talking about our work. So this is called The Shape of Design, and when I'm sort of analyzing the shape of design, I think it's important to note, it's important to draw in outside sources when I do this. So if this is our brain, there's a little bit of it reserved for very specific tasks. So kerning, CSS3 techniques, memorizing all the different kinds of border radius that you need to use, all of those things. There's very little spots for those things, but there's this whole other side of the brain that things that we know, influences outside of design that I think are really beneficial to bring in when we discuss our livelihood and our craft. So I've got a few of these things, and these are a few of the things that I'll be mentioning today. So philosophy, anthropology, history, and basically anything that you would talk about if you're wearing a tweed jacket in front of a bunch of people, okay? So if we're discussing the shape of design, I think the logical place to start, and sort of the big question is, what is a designer? And this is something that I keep coming back to because I feel like that's the last thing that I need to design, or last thing I need to mention to a room of designers. But I don't have a good answer for this myself. So I went out looking for answers to this. And the most common one is that a lot of people say that designers are visual communicators. And I don't really buy that. Because especially with things like web design, sometimes we do a lot of things that aren't necessarily very visual, right? We're making plans, we're making branding guidelines, we're designing systems and frameworks and all of that. And that's not even necessarily a very visual thing. So to say that we're visual communicators feels like it breaks a little bit. So that's not quite right. So I picked up some books. It's a scary thought, but I did it. And there's this one by a guy named Bruno Munari, and what he said was, a designer is a planner with an aesthetic sense. This feels a little closer to me. Now, this book is actually fantastic because it's from the 40s. It's still in print, and it's sort of like the first design blog. It was this series of articles that he was writing for a newspaper that came out every few weeks, typically focused on mitigating the space between art and design, because that was sort of the issue of the day. So this feels a little bit closer. I think it's still a little bit off, but we'll run with that definition for now, and we'll come back to it. So for a planner with an aesthetic sense, I think that we kind of get into the systems thinking, right? If we're planning, we get into this little thing called design thinking, right? And chances are you've heard a lot about this, like the design thinking. And honestly, like everybody's just totally gushing over this, just in love with this concept of design thinking and the nobility of all of that. And I think that that's true, but there's also a small portion of that that I'm a little suspicious of. Are you noticing a trend here? Okay. So with design thinking, it's really interesting because designers love that, but I think it makes a lot of complications with one group of people. These guys. And illustrator, graphic designer, web designer, whatever it is, we kind of have to work with clients. It's the necessity of what we do. And how we approach the work and how we do the work has sort of created this odd situation. And that weird situation is that designers and clients are on opposite sides of the same coin. Let me explain that a little bit. I've made a very complex chart for you guys to take a look at. I've taken a few liberties with this. Okay, so on the left, we have the designer, right? And on the right, we have the client. This is this is an especially troublesome client, we'll say. And the designer goes through this design thinking process, aka magic. I still can't really get a good definition for design thinking from anybody either. So the designer goes through this design thinking process, and then from that process, they formulate a plan, right? And then that plan usually dictates the stuff that we make, right? So we come up with a plan, and we make thing 1, thing 2, thing 3. We make a website, we make an iPhone app, we make a mobile version of the website, we make a poster, we make a brochure, we make an identity, we make branding guidelines, this. And if I were to print out this and set it in front of a designer, and I'd say, okay, designer, do me a favor and pull out a Sharpie and use your marker and just mark the part that you think, where is the value of what you do, right? Where is the value of your job? And they would probably mark it a lot like this, right? So they would say, you know, the real value of what I do for a living is on this side, right? It's on that left side. It's that design thinking. It's the plan that I do. That's the stuff that makes me a good designer, or at least very, very valuable to my clients. But I bet that if you were to ask a client the same thing, they would say, okay, client, would you mark the part of this diagram that makes the designer that you work with valuable to you? They would probably mark this side. So it's sort of this unusual situation where as you're a designer, you think that the value of what you do, or at least I think oftentimes the value of what I do, is sort of the plan that I come up with. It's the strategy that I devise. It's how I approach the work. And then, you know, I execute the work because it obviously needs to be done. I've got this awesome plan I came up with, but I need to execute it. And if you ask the client, you know, why are you hiring a designer? They're not going to say, I need a new strategy for this and this and this. They're probably going to say, I need a website. Or I need an iPhone app to do that one thing that I want it to do. So what it means is that there's usually this general disagreement on what the value is of design between a designer and a client. And it sort of makes this really interesting work atmosphere. And I think it causes a lot of angst, turmoil, and the times that it lines up, it seems really special when you both know that the value of what you're providing is the same thing, whichever side that is. Regardless, that general disagreement isn't a very good thing for us designers, because we just sort of say, why can't I get no respect? Or we get our feelings hurt because we pour ourselves into the work and it gets shot down for some reason, and we just sort of say to ourselves that we want to know what love is. We just want to feel appreciated for all this work that we put in, and we work and work and work and slave away and show up and then just tossed aside, tossed in the hat. Sometimes that's really frustrating as a designer. We should probably get over it, but we want people to love us because we're soft and cuddly. And this kind of gets to maybe one of the issues, one of the reasons that there might be this foundational disconnect there. And it's that you can't really measure design very well. You can get analytics, you can get metrics, but to try to isolate them in a way that allows you to make educated decisions based on measurements with design, it's a really difficult thing to do. It stays touchy-feely, even if you have millions of users and millions of data sets, I would say. And this is actually flies in the face of how most businesses operate, because businesses at their base are risk averse. If you walk into a business and you say, if you want to put $10,000 on the line to potentially make $400,000, or would you rather put that same $10,000 on the line and be guaranteed to make 20, they would probably choose the first, right? Businesses are made to be more safe, or at least risk averse. What's happening? Oh, okay. Was it not parallel? You're a designer too. Good. Obsessive compulsive. Perfect. So I think maybe to kind of gain some understanding about these metrics that I'm talking about, we need to look back a little bit. And this is where I get into the Tweety type of analogies and information here. So my main man, Marshall McLuhan, he said, we look into the present through a rearview mirror, we march backwards into the future. And this is what I tried to do. When I was looking at this relationship, I was sort of saying, okay, why are businesses risk averse? What does it mean that you can't measure design? And I started looking at metrics, and it led me to this thing right here. It's called the logic machine. You all know the logic machine if you don't know the logic machine. We're going to go way back. Tim went back, what, 500 years? I think I'm going to top that with this guy. I'm going to go back to Socrates. So I'm the guy talking about antiquities at a web design conference. So you know about this logic machine that Socrates invented. Let's go through this. So if A equals B and B equals C, C equals A, right? So if magnetic things are attracted to magnets and paper clips are magnetic, the paper clip gets attracted to the magnet, right? Logic, simple. Now the interesting thing about this logic machine is that it's everywhere. The logic machine is how most businesses run. We're starting to see more businesses that don't operate on this logic mechanism, but more often than not, I would say 80% of businesses operate on logic. And the reason that businesses sort of operate on logic is because it makes a big promise to all of us. The reason it's so popular, the reason that it's a main mode of thinking, is because with logic, what it promises is if you put data into one side of this factory, it promises to spit out control out of the other side. And that seems to be really important if you're a business and you're risk averse. Like, you want control. You want to know what's going to happen if you do this thing. That's what we use data for, right? It's like we gather analytics, we gather statistics to sort of say, what's going to happen if I move this ad higher on the page? Am I going to lose viewers? What's going to happen if I make this text a lighter shade of gray? Am I going to lose readers? What happens if I make the type smaller? What happens if I do this, this, this? We gather all this data about all of these things. And the logic machine promises that if we feed it through logic, we can get control from that. But the bad thing about it is, I would say that right now, we have more data than ever. And I personally, as a designer, feel like I have less control than I ever have. So the logic machine is breaking a little bit. And that sort of creates a bit of anxiety in me personally, and with a few other designers that I've spoken to this about. It's the fact that this promise that we were made about having data and promise and control actually hasn't really panned out very well for us. Now, Socrates had another main man named Aristotle. Here he's carved out of stone, looking really buff, very dapper, very well-maintained beard there. And what he said was, he sort of came along and he said, wait. Okay, so this logic machine that you guys have, there's actually more to that. And he started putting qualifiers on the logic machine. So what he said was, the logic machine, that thing, it kind of only works in this thing that we call the domain of truth. I wrote it really fancy because it sounds super philosophical, right? It just sounds so profound. If you're going to go get a tattoo this weekend, you should get the Build logo, or you should get domain of truth tattooed somewhere on your body, like over your heart or something. So to explain what the domain of truth is, Aristotle goes a little bit further, and he says, the domain of truth is where things cannot be other than they are. And that sounds very convoluted, but it's ironically logical. Science, right? So the paperclip, the magnet example, things that are magnetic will always be attracted to magnets. There's absolutes there. There's a predictability to it. Things there cannot be other than what they are. These are laws. These are rules. These are like foundational things about how the world operates. But that is starkly different, I would say, than design. Because with design, if you give the same prompt to 4 different people, the same creative prompt to 4 different people, you get 4 different results. If they followed logic, if logic really mattered, they would all come to the same result, right? But they don't. So the reason for that is because design deals with this little troublesome, irksome, beautiful, wonderful thing, and that is people. Design is for people, very clearly. We make things for people. We produce things that people use. We produce things that people consume. We produce things that people read and watch and learn from and become informed by. These are all wonderful things, and that's the role of design, but all of that is concerned with people. And the thing with people is that people are not logical all of the time. We're actually kind of emotional and squishy usually. So like if Andy walked up to me and said, Frank, do you want to have pancakes for dinner tonight? I would love that. Like breakfast for dinner is like one of the best things in my book. But if he said that again tomorrow night, I wouldn't be too privy for it, right? Because if you have breakfast for dinner 2 nights in a row, it's probably like a, I don't know, it probably means that you've got a bigger problem and you need to get your life together a little bit, right? So people are illogical, we're emotional and squishy, and I think that we see this a lot with design and technology where things operate on logic and it breaks for us. A couple weeks ago, I bought some wool socks on Amazon, and now Amazon is trying to sell me sock monkeys. Now, if a person were making that recommendation, they would not think that. They would be able to understand how illogical recommending me sock monkeys is. I mean, from a computer standpoint, it's perfectly logical, but from a human recommendation, probably not, right? They would probably recommend things like shoes or I don't know, other things, slippers, those sorts of things. But logic breaks when we work with people. So here's what my main man, manly beard Aristotle said. He said, let's make a second machine to go with this logic machine. So if the stipulation on the first machine, the logic machine, is where things cannot be other than what they are, then the second one becomes where things can be other than what they are. And he quantifies this a little bit more, and bear with me here because I'm just quoting him, and he sort of has this way of saying things. So he calls it the technical know-how, the skill, the craft, and art. It's involved in production, manufacturing, and making. Using good deliberation, understanding, resulting in deliberate desire to be carried out with cleverness. First time I read this a few weeks ago, I just literally did this, just in shock, because I realized that I didn't go back far enough to get my definition of design. So I read that, and I'm like, that's exactly it. I want to read that last part again. Using good deliberation, understanding, resulting in deliberate desire to be carried out with cleverness. And then baking in things like skill, craft, and art. Production, manufacturing, making. That's the best definition of design that I've ever come across. And I never heard this in that context. And this only happens with that second machine where things can be other than what they are. And if we're talking about places where things can be other than what they are, it kind of leads us into the idea of a paradox. Everybody kind of knows what a paradox is. It's sort of a chicken and egg situation. Which one came first? That's where things can be other than what they are, where we have two pieces of conflicting information, and maybe somehow both of those things can be true. Now, can I get audio? I had forgotten about this. If I can't, that's fine. OK, no problem. I'll just dub over this. So there's a clip at the beginning of Annie Hall. It's a film by Woody Allen, and I like it quite a bit. And I'm going to pull this up. He's wearing tweed, too. Is it going to go? There we go. So what he's saying here is he's telling a joke. I think a lot of times paradoxes show up as jokes, as funny things. And the joke at the beginning of Annie Hall is two women walk into a Catskills mountain resort. And they go into the diner and they sit down to eat. And they order their food, and their food shows up. And while they're eating, one of the women says, "The food in this place is just absolutely awful." And then the other woman says, "I know, in such small portions, too." And then it's so easy doing stand-up if you're using someone else's material that people already think is funny. And then he goes on to make this analogy that that's sort of what life is like, right? So the food is awful, which is kind of a pessimistic view, but it's Woody Allen. The food is awful, and the portions are so small. That's kind of what life is like. And he makes this really great analogy that there's a lot of bad things that happen in life, but at the end of life, you're always left wanting more of it. And I think that by considering paradox, by saying that we can have two things live in our head at the same time, even though they conflict, they can both still somehow be true, I think that we can get to really profound, excellent thoughts that way. This shows up in things like wordplay. So if I say a silent movie sounds good, there's a humor to that. It's maybe not like everybody's going to like coil over in laughter. But I think the times that we have a physical response to things, the times that we cry and the times that we laugh, are the times that we're communicating the most effectively. If you can elicit a physical response in somebody that's caused by an emotion, whew, that's gold. Can we do it on the web? Yeah, I think so. The irony of this is that even the most analytical, objective people realize this. This is Niels Bohr. He kind of discovered the structure of the atom. And he has this really great quote that says, "The opposite of a true statement is a false statement. And the opposite of a profound truth may be another profound truth." So that is to say, when we're dealing with laws, when we're dealing with true statements, things that are true or false, those are opposites. But when we're dealing with things that are more soft, like the concept of truth and people and things that are alogical, the opposite of a profound truth might just be another one. Now, the reason that paradox, I think, is important is because people are paradoxical, but also because as we get more data, as we get more digital, and we have all of this data available to us, as it gets easier to make things and measure things, we get more conflicting information. And I think that there's it's not information overload, it's information anxiety. And I've realized in myself and in friends that the more conflicting information we have, we sort of have a de facto response to that. And that response is typically cynicism. Back in the 80s in the States, scientists were going back and forth about whether eggs were good for you or not. So one week they would say eggs are bad for you, there's too much cholesterol. And then another group of scientists would come back maybe a month later and say, actually, there's a lot of cholesterol, but there's this special type of good cholesterol for you. And pretty much what happened was, my dad got sick of that, and he said, screw it, I'm just going to eat eggs because I like eggs. But when we have this conflicting information, we respond with a certain amount of cynicism and a disconnect from it. And I think that that's exactly the wrong type of response we need to have to conflicting information. If it's an absolute truth, then sure, we should be probably cynical towards that and really question it hardly. But if we're dealing with profound truth, we need to learn how to rationalize these differences inside of ourselves. And paradox becomes really important because there's this sort of default definition of creativity that bubbles up all over the place. And it's that creativity is merging two incongruent ideas. So if you do that, you could sort of say that in a large part, creativity is about embracing paradox. So if you want to do creative work, if you want to speak to people that are illogical, to be creative, you need to embrace this sort of paradox. And the beauty of it is that when we're talking to people, these beautiful alogical people, when we make things, we can consider that the world and how we see it around us is malleable. We can choose how we interpret the things that go on around us. And I think one of the main ways that we make sense and interpret the world around us is through this little thing called story. When you go back to how Aristotle said, the second machine that he's building where things can be other than they are, it was how do we make decisions in that system? And it was a process that was called arguments, if I remember right. And basically it wasn't fighting. It was projecting possible outcomes to certain decisions. That's a story. And I think that story is in our bones. It's how we make sense of things. When I come home and let's say I'm having dinner with a friend, there's a question there, right? How was your day? And I tell them the story of how my day went. And in large part, that tells them a story about what happened to me. But maybe more importantly, by telling that story, I can actually frame what happened in that day and make a little bit more sense of it. Stories in our bones, and I've got a nice example of it. This is a painting by Edward Hopper. It's called Nighthawks, a quintessential American painting. And when you look at it, there's a couple really striking things. The first is sort of like, how did these people get in there, right? So there's no doors. How did these people get into this diner? And you start analyzing it, and there's definitely a setting, and there's a mood, and there's a tone to it. We've got characters. And the thing is, we respond to the quality of this. And we look at it, and we say, okay, so that guy's working, and I don't know, he's making, let's say, a milkshake for that couple over there. And that couple, if you really look at them, they're not really looking at each other, but they're sitting beside one another. So maybe they're a couple, and they had a bad first date, or they're a couple, and maybe they went to a party of something, and maybe had a fight, and they're just making amends. And then you look at that last guy with his back towards all of us, and it's like, ugh, that guy's having a hell of a day. Something awful happened to him. And the thing is, I think everybody has this response to this painting. We look at it and we perceive quality and we project a story into it. There's no story here. There's only characters, there's only tone, and there's only setting. And this painting feels incomplete. That makes us uncomfortable. So to make sense of it, we tell a story. And I think a large part that's how we frame our design process. That's how we make decisions in our design process if we're doing it right. And we think about possible outcomes. And I think if we do our job right as designers, if it's of a high enough quality, people will make stories about what we make. Because the simple fact is, I think that stories bond us. Back in the 50s in New York, on Madison Avenue, there was a beggar who was sat out on the street, and one of the ad men would walk by him every single day. And he just had a sign that said blind, and he would have a cup out there to beg for money. And one day in May, this ad man that walked by this guy every single day looked at him and said, I've got to do something. So he pulls a pen or a marker out of his pocket, and he asks the guy, can I make a few changes to your sign? And the guy agrees, which is a pretty big jump of trust right there, which is incredible. So the ad man picks up the sign and he writes a few more things. And he changes it from just saying blind to saying this. I think stories teach us to empathize as well. They teach us to relate to one another. And I think that there's a high communicative power to storytelling. So, and maybe another example of that is this little jerk right here. Is everybody familiar with this jerk? So this is Wally, and Wally's he made me cry in front of all my friends. That's what I'm trying to get up here and say. Wally made me cry in front of all of my friends. And the thing about the movie Wally is, okay, he's a robot, right? I don't know if you can see that, but he's a robot, and he's not a person. He doesn't have feelings. He's not even a personified animal. Right? So he's not like any character in most of the other Pixar or Disney movies. Like, he's not even an animal that can talk. He's a robot, and he's never been alive, and he says like 4 things, and he made a grown man cry in a movie theater. That movie is just completely storytelling. And through the power of storytelling, I'm empathizing with somebody that's just like circuit boards, that's like a little garbage man. That's the power of it. I think it's seductive as well. And it's not enough to conquer, one must know how to seduce. And the beauty of that statement is, I think through storytelling, we can seduce people to do really wonderful things. And if you seduce them, you don't need to conquer them. Which maybe brings us to what is success in design. You know, if this is the sort of situation that we're living in, what does success in design look like? Well, there's a couple key things that we can use design for, right? So we can use design to persuade people of a certain viewpoint. We can use design to inform people as well. So if we have information, we can disperse information through design. And I think that there's a third one. This comes from a designer named Milton Glaser. He's one of my favorites, really brilliant man. And there's a third one here, delight. And obviously you can do jobs that are a combination of these three things in any combination, but delight seems to get the shaft a little bit, right? Oftentimes when I'm hired by clients, it's my job to communicate and make them do the thing I want them to do. And it's really liberating for me to do personal work or to try to push a client in a direction that requires me to delight my audience. I've made this design nobility pyramid, and this isn't necessarily a value system. It's just more about the potential for badness from each one of these. So at the bottom, you have persuasion. And the reason I have persuasion at the bottom of this nobility pyramid is mostly because you can persuade things of things that are good and true, or you can persuade people to do really awful things. So this can be used in both manners. The second way is to inform, right? So you're giving people information. I think that that always needs to be true, because if you're informing people of things that are not true, it's not informing them, it's misinforming them. And then at the top, I put delight, because it's my favorite, and I play favorites. But it's hard to think of a bad thing that happens from making somebody feel delighted with something that you've made. And the reason I say that is because when I say delight, I think that when you delight somebody, you're giving them a small lesson in seeing the world as something good. And that's why I've got it at the top of that nobility pyramid. And if I had to boil this down, I would say that delighting people is sort of design's superpower. This is our superpower. We can make things that delight people. Sure, we can persuade people. Yes, we can inform people. But how many folks have the ability to really delight someone else on such a wide scale? Not many. Not many. How many people get the opportunity to make other people feel something? Not a lot. But we sort of hit a paradox here, because I would say in our efforts to try to perform better, the work actually gets worse sometimes, a lot of times. So as we try to perform better, the work usually gets less thoughtful and less delightful. You know, there's that Tibor Kalman quote that's been going around the internet. If you try to make something that nobody hates, no one loves it. I think that that's true. So here's a couple movies. On the left, we've got Avatar, which is a big villain to me. And it's like the highest grossing movie ever. It's like made the most money from any movie that's ever been a movie, right? Everybody saw Avatar. Everybody wore the stupid glasses. We all saw Avatar, and not a fan. I thought it was shallow. I thought it was predictable. It was very template. On the right is a still from a Fellini movie called 8½. It's a very bizarre, surreal film. But it's a movie about making a movie. It's very meta. I suggest you see it. The thing of it is that I think Avatar tries to please everybody and actually is worse because of it. And I think that Fellini, when he made 8½, said, I'm going to make this for a very specific group of people. And if it resonates with you, it really resonates with you. So if you talk to somebody who's seen 8½, it's a love it or hate it sort of thing. But the people that love that movie love that movie. So in our efforts to try to perform better, we've sort of established patterns that are sort of wasted opportunities. I see these buttons all over the place, and it's not necessarily about following somebody on Twitter. It's this exact phrasing, right? So at the beginning, this started out as somebody measuring which phrasing worked the best. And that's great. But what happened is everybody copied it. And now that this is everywhere, it doesn't mean anything to me. So the more homogenized this messaging becomes, the less valuable and less successful it works. it breaks the more people use it. And it's a wasted opportunity because the more homogenized that gets, it becomes not real and not meaningful and not sincere, and I don't think that it becomes delightful. It's sort of like a wasted opportunity to be a real person. And the fact is I think people are bored by the homogeny of all of this. If you go into Google and you do that suggested search terms, you pull it up and you just type in "the internet is," you get a lot of suggestions, most of which are about cats and tubes. But the interesting thing to me was boring was above porn. So people are more bored by the internet than, I guess, horny, which is really interesting because this is the opposite of what I think it would be. So people, this thing that has, like everything in the world, this internet thing, people are bored. And that, I don't know where to place the blame on which end of that. But I know that homogeny is not a good thing, especially if it's so easy to publish, especially if it's so easy to say what you really want to say. And the instinct that I've been getting is that it's really damn slick. And I think that things can be slick and have meaningful, awesome content and be the best thing in the world. I've got a meaningful example of that in my pocket right now, right? So this is slick, but it feels humane at the same time. It feels empathetic when I use it. But there's other things that are slick, and they're just slickness for slick's sake. That's really hard to say, by the way. And it doesn't feel like it's executed quite right. And I've got this thing that I've been saying lately, and I think that being squishy is more important than being slick. And what I mean by that is it's more important to present yourself as like a full human being and to talk about things while you're in the middle of it, instead of being slick, cool operator, and acting like you have it all figured out. So in the work, I try to make this very purposeful decision to sort of be skillful, but at the same time be a little vulnerable with it as well. And when I get jobs through my door, I look at what the final thing's going to be, and I ask myself, is this nourishing? When I say delight, I sort of mean this overlap between surprise and clarity. If something surprises you, but it communicates extremely clear, I think that that's delightful. Now, sometimes this happens on accident. There's an unexpected relevancy, and it happens as serendipity. And I think this is the best example of serendipity that I've ever seen. This is the best error message of all error messages, right? So unknown is capitalized, capital U, so it's a proper noun. And the best part about this error message is you can only accept it. You can't cancel it. The only thing you can do is say OK. It's nice to think that your software has pathos to it. Let me give you another example of delighting people. This is how you log on to the free Wi-Fi at the airport in my hometown, Portland, Oregon. It's clean enough. It's not the best design thing in the world, but it's like 2 buttons, yes, no. It's very direct. There's another hotel called the Ace Hotel in Portland, and it does one of my favorite things ever. When you log on to their free Wi-Fi, this is what you see. That's it. It's surprising, but it's actually very clear. They never get asked how to log on to the free Wi-Fi. Never. And I think that we can use these things, this mode of thinking of trying to delight our users and trying to present ourselves as human beings. We can be skillful, we can be vulnerable, we can be thoughtful, and more importantly, we can be human. And I think delighting people changes our mindset because we're not visual communicators anymore. We're sort of gift givers. We're trying to please our audiences and give them what they need. And if we do that really well, it feels like a gift. Because the fact is that attention's the most scarce resource right now, even on the web. Mostly on the web. You guys know this. You live there. You work there, right? And I feel like any time that somebody spends time with something that I've made, it's a gift. And I feel like we need to reciprocate that gift. Because I think that the shape of design, and I think the real value of design, is actually very complicated, but at the same time very, very simple. I think that if we want to make good design, if we want to do good things on the web, if we want to do good things with the things that we make, we need to have messages we believe, and we need to gift them to people that we care about. If I look at all the work that I've done the past years, the times that the work has been the best are the times that all of these things have lined up. I've cared about what I'm saying, and care intensely about the people that I'm talking to. And the fact is, I'm mostly a designer and an illustrator up here, and I think a lot of you are out there are, front-end developers and interaction designers and web designers, and we all have our own little specialty with this. But I think by changing our mindset and thinking about how it's okay to have two conflicting opinions, how anytime we make something, we need to treat it like a gift, and we need to be thoughtful about what we produce and to try to delight our users. If we take that mindset and we apply it to our own little specialties, we each have our own little corner. So I can try to do this in my illustration work. I can try to do this in my writing. If you're a programmer, you can try to do it with your programming. If you're doing user interface design, you can add all of these small little bits, and you can be really empathetic and very human with your user interface design. And I think that if we each have these little corners that we each chip away at, I really think that that will go a long way to making this a better place. So, thank you.